Commercial use of Newfoundland and Labrador's forests started in the second half of the 1800s. At first, it was based on sawmilling. The largest and most successful sawmills existed on the island. They were generally located in central and western Newfoundland. That's also where the island's best forests are located. A Nova Scotian business, the Grand River Company, also established a mill at Mud Lake in Labrador and began logging operations there. By 1901, the colony boasted close to 200 sawmills that employed 2,400 workers. But the industry relied primarily on white pine trees, and that soon created a problem. Most of the island's trees were balsam fir and black spruce. Years of intense harvesting soon caused the white pine trees to become depleted. When the biggest and best trees disappeared, so too did many of the sawmill operators. The industry fell into decline. The colony was left with forests that consisted mostly of black spruce and balsam fir. These trees could not support a sawmilling industry, but it turned out that they were perfect for a newly emerging pulp and paper industry. Newfoundland trees were particularly well suited for the manufacture of newsprint. Two mills dominated the Pre-Confederation pulp and paper industry. They were both located on the island, one in Grand Falls and another in Corner Brook. At the start of the 20th century, a pair of British newspaper moguls became interested in establishing a pulp and paper mill in Newfoundland. Alfred and Harold Harmsworth owned several mass daily newspapers, including London's Daily Mail and Daily Mirror. Worried that their supply of newsprint might run out, they decided to manufacture their own. The Harmsworth publishing empire eyed various North American locations before settling on Newfoundland in 1903 and on Grand Falls in 1904. The region had a lot to offer. Its vast forests of spruce and fir were ideal for the manufacture of newsprint. There was a waterfall to generate hydroelectricity to power the mill, and logs could be floated from the forests to the mill along the Exploits River and its tributaries. The nearby community of Botwood even had a deep water port where Newfoundland newsprint could be shipped to customers in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. The Newfoundland and Labrador government was also easy to work with. Eager to diversify the colony's economy into areas other than the fishery, it offered the Harmsworths generous incentives to establish the pulp and paper mill. Mason Beaton was the Harmsworths' representative in Newfoundland. In 1905, he registered the Anglo-Newfoundland Development Company to oversee the project. It was called the And Company for short. 4 years later, the mill and powerhouse were up and running. At the time, it was the biggest and most modern pulp and paper complex on the planet. The mill opened with 3 paper-making machines. Together, they could produce 30,000 tons of newsprint a year. The mill's production capacity doubled in 1912 with the addition of 2 more paper machines. Grand Falls had the natural resources that were needed to open a paper mill, but there was still a problem. The project would need hundreds of workers to keep it running, but it was built in an area where almost no one lived. The And Company simply decided to build its own town. It was an enormous undertaking, but the company didn't waste any time. Almost overnight, it transformed an unpeopled wilderness into the town of Grand Falls. Within 2 years of the mill's opening, it had a population of 1,600 people. Families lived in houses provided by the company, and no one was allowed to live in the town unless they worked in the mill or had permission from the company. The mill attracted settlers to other communities too. The logging towns of Badger, Norris Arm, and Millertown all grew after they started to supply the Grand Falls mill with wood in 1909. The success led to the opening of other pulp and paper mills on the island too, but most struggled to remain afloat. In 1911, Albert E. Reed and Company opened a pulp mill at Bishop's Falls. That's about 16 kilometers downstream from Grand Falls. But the Reed Company did not have the enormous financial resources of the Harmsworths, and it struggled to remain profitable. Problems only intensified after the outbreak of war in 1914. In 1916, the Reed Company sold its mill and timber rights to the Harmsworths. The And Company continued to produce pulp at the Bishop's Falls mill, which it then sent to Grand Falls for further processing into newsprint. Two other companies also opened pulp and paper mills. In 1914, the Horwood Lumber Company established a pulp mill at Campbellton in Notre Dame Bay. Operations halted a year later after the company's main dam failed. The Terra Nova Sulfite Company began building a paper mill at Glovertown in the 1920s, but ran out of money before construction ended. It sold all its timber rights to the And Company in 1923. It started shipping Glovertown wood to the Grand Falls Mill. All the while, business had been steadily expanding at Grand Falls. The demand for newsprint was so strong that the And Company brought a sixth paper-making machine online in 1925. By then, the company had more than doubled the area of woods under its control. Nonetheless, a new mill on the West Coast would soon surpass Grand Falls in size and output. In the early 1900s, industrialists became increasingly interested in establishing a pulp and paper mill in the Humber Valley. The region had dense forests of spruce and fir. It also had waterfalls that could generate hydroelectricity, and it was connected to the Trans-Island Railway. The line had been built by the Reed Newfoundland Company in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The Reed family owned enormous swaths of timberland in the region and wanted to enter the pulp and paper industry. In 1914, they formed the Newfoundland Products Corporation to build a mill complex at Corner Brook. But when war broke out that same year, it put everything on hold. In 1921, Reed partnered with the British engineering firm of Armstrong, Whitworth and Company to revive the project. Negotiations lasted for 2 years and resulted in the formation of the Newfoundland Power and Paper Company in 1923. Armstrong and Whitworth became the leading developers, while the Reeds took a less active role in the project. Construction started in 1923 and moved at a fast pace. 2 years later, there were 40 acres of buildings at Corner Brook. That included the mill itself and 100 houses for workers. There was also a main dam on Junction Brook and a hydroelectric station at Deer Lake. The first paper was produced in the summer of 1925. The mill and power station had a dramatic effect on the region as more and more wilderness gave way to residential areas for loggers and mill workers. By the beginning of the 1930s, the population of the area from Curling to Humbermouth had reached 10,000. Despite this growth, the Corner Brook Mill did not have a smooth start. Construction costs had far exceeded original estimates. The Newfoundland Power and Paper Company soon found itself in dire financial straits. In 1927, it decided to sell the mill to the International Paper Company of New York. International operated the mill for a little over a decade, but struggled to make ends meet during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Unlike the Grand Falls Mill, Corner Brook did not have a secure market for its products. It was badly impacted by a steep drop in demand for newsprint from the United States. The mill reported a $1 million profit in 1929, but then watched its earnings steadily decline. In 1933, it reported an annual loss of $170,000. It experienced a string of consecutive annual losses for the next 6 years. A turning point came in 1938 when International sold the mill to Bowaters. It was a British company that was one of Europe's largest newsprint manufacturers. Bowaters had excellent business contacts and vast financial resources. The company expanded production at the Corner Brook mill and reported a profit of $340,000 in 1939. That was the mill's first profit since 1932. Business remained strong and earnings generally increased over the next decade. In 1948, the Corner Brook mill reported a profit of $3.6 million. By then, it was the largest paper mill on the planet. The pulp and paper industry had many effects in Newfoundland and Labrador. It led to the creation of new communities and to the growth of others. It also helped to diversify the economy into a new sector. However, not all of the profits flowed into the Newfoundland and Labrador economy. The mills were owned by foreign companies who obtained generous agreements from the government. Most of their land was freehold or provided at very low cost. Perhaps the greatest contribution in the Pre-Confederation era was the creation of badly needed jobs. The mills provided full-time employment for thousands of workers, while logging offered steady seasonal work at a time of the year when the fishery was closed.